It was the summer of 1810, the kind of English summer that made even heartbreak look picturesque. The lawns of Winthorne Hall shimmered beneath golden light, laughter echoed from the marble terrace, and the air smelled faintly of roses and champagne. Beneath the arch of climbing ivy stood Lady Clara Winthorne, a girl of 19 with eyes too bright for a world that rewarded indifference. That evening she wore her first grown lady's gown, blush silk trimmed in pearls, the colour of innocence and hope. Every debutante in London envied her youth, her beauty, her charm. But Clara's heart belonged to only one man, Elias Hawthorne, heir to the Duke of Ashbourne, a man 8 years her senior and utterly beyond her reach. She had loved him since she was a girl, running barefoot through her father's gardens when he'd visited as a family friend. He was the kind of man who looked at the world as if it owed him nothing, and yet everything came to him all the same. Clara had spent years trying to earn his notice, through letters never sent, smiles never returned, courage never rewarded. Tonight she had promised herself she would speak. Not as the silly child he once teased, but as a woman who knew what she wanted. The ballroom of Winthorne Hall glowed with candlelight and chatter. Couples spun to the rhythm of violins, silk skirts brushed against polished floors, and the air glittered with perfume and pride. Clara's heart thudded painfully as she watched Elias across the room. Tall, impeccably dressed, and already surrounded by admirers. When he turned and their eyes met, she smiled, softly, bravely. For a moment his expression warmed, then vanished behind the cool mask of aristocratic detachment. Still she crossed the floor toward him. "My lord," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You promised me a dance." He hesitated, as though debating whether to indulge her. Then with a small bow, he extended his hand. "So I did, Lady Clara." The music swelled, and she let him lead her into the waltz. It should have been the moment she dreamed of. His hand firm at her waist, the candlelight glinting off his dark hair. But his touch felt distant, his gaze elsewhere. "You've grown," he said at last, as if making a simple observation. She smiled nervously. "And you've become impossible to impress." He almost laughed, almost. "You mistake indifference for difficulty, my lady?" Her courage flickered, but she pressed on. "And what if I said I wished to change that indifference?" He raised a brow, amused. "You would be foolish to try." The words stung, but she refused to retreat. "Then call me foolish," she said quietly, her voice trembling with conviction. "Because I do not wish for your favor, Elias. I wish for your heart." The waltz slowed. Around them the world continued to turn, unaware, uncaring, while time seemed to still between them. For a long, aching moment, he said nothing. Then his hand dropped from hers. "You are young," he said coldly, "and young women often mistake admiration for love." Her breath caught. "You think this is admiration?" "I think it is inexperience," he replied, his tone slicing cleanly through the air. "Find a man of your own station, Clara, one who can return your sentiment without it being a scandal." She flinched, colour draining from her face. "And you? What will you find, my lord? Pride to keep you company?" His expression hardened. "Pride, my lady, is far safer than affection." The music ended. The silence that followed was louder than applause. Guests watched as she turned and fled, her skirts brushing past whispers that would follow her long after the night was over. Later, in the solitude of her room, Clara tore the ribbons from her hair and let the tears fall freely. The rejection replayed again and again, His cold tone, his careful words. She had bared her heart, and he had dismissed it like a child's fancy. By dawn, her pillow was soaked, her innocence gone. Her mother found her at the window, still in her ball gown, eyes hollow. "He is not the only man in England," her mother said gently. Clara's voice was soft but steady. "No, but he is the only one I will ever remember." And she kept her word. Years passed. The name Lady Clara Winthorne faded from London's gossip columns, replaced by newer scandals and brighter debutantes. She withdrew to her aunt's estate in the countryside, devoting her time to charity and music, her heart quiet, her spirit reshaped by solitude. The girl who once waited by ballroom doors became a woman who closed them. She no longer wore pinks or pearls, but soft blues and greys, colours of calm, of distance. And when asked about love, she only smiled faintly and said, "I learned what I needed to know." What she did not know was that time, with its cruel sense of irony, was already weaving the threads of fate once more. For even pride, especially pride, cannot outrun destiny. And when the Duke of Ashbourne returned to London years later, widowed and weary, the first woman to meet his gaze across the ballroom would be the one he once left, standing in tears beneath a chandelier. Only now she would not be waiting. The winter of 1817 settled over London like a shroud. Snow blanketed the rooftops, muffling the noise of carriages, dimming even the laughter from the gentlemen's clubs along St. James's. In a townhouse of faded grandeur, Elias Hawthorne, now the Duke of Ashbourne, stood before his mirror and scarcely recognized the man who stared back. Gone was the arrogant youth who once dismissed love as folly. The mirror reflected a man in his 30s, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, temples touched with grey, and a loneliness that no title could disguise. He had inherited the dukedom 2 years earlier, buried his father, and broken off an engagement to a woman whose heart he had never truly held. Society called him dignified, untouchable, but solitude had made him hollow. And lately every dream carried the same face, a face from another lifetime. Clara. He had tried to forget her. He had succeeded for a while, until the guilt began to seep through the cracks of pride. Time had taught him what arrogance refused to, that sincerity is a rarity, and that rejection can echo louder than desire. So when he received the invitation to the Winthorne charity ball, hosted by her cousin, he hesitated only once before deciding to attend. If she was there, he told himself, it would be mere coincidence, a polite call, nothing more, but the lie tasted bitter before he even finished it. The night of the ball shimmered with candlelight and scandal. The great hall was a sea of gold silk and whispers, ladies in jewels, gentlemen in fine coats, all vying for attention beneath chandeliers that glittered like frozen stars. When Elias entered, conversation faltered briefly, then resumed with renewed curiosity. The Duke of Ashbourne had become something of a myth, a man who appeared rarely, spoke little, and seemed impervious to charm. Yet even myths can falter. For as his gaze swept the room, it stopped, abruptly, irrevocably. There she was, Lady Clara Winthorne, no longer the blushing girl he remembered, but a woman transformed. Her gown was a deep emerald that made her eyes burn like green fire, her hair pinned in elegant curls, her posture effortless and sure. She was surrounded by conversation, smiling with grace that looked unstudied, the kind of composure only born of a heartbreak endured and survived. His chest tightened. She looks untouched by time, he thought, and yet everything about her has changed. As he watched her, something strange happened. The memory of his cruel words from years ago You mistake admiration for love. Returned, not as a regret, but as a wound freshly reopened. He had once dismissed her as naive. Now she was the most self-possessed woman in the room. And he was a man who had spent years learning how to live without her, only to realize he had never succeeded. "Your Grace," came a familiar voice. It was Lord Everett, an old friend from their youth. "You're staring. The lady you're so intent on is none other than the belle of this season's gossip, Lady Clara Winthorne. A curious story, hers. Turned down a dozen suitors, they say. Quite the triumph for independence. Or perhaps she's merely choosy." Elias forced a thin smile. "Or perhaps she's wise." Everett chuckled. "Careful, Ashbourne. She may recall your youthful arrogance. I doubt she forgives easily." "I don't expect her to," Elias said softly. He left his friend mid-laugh and crossed the floor before doubt could drag him back. When Clara saw him, her smile faltered, only for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Time seemed to fold between them. The orchestra swelled, but the world grew soundless. "Your Grace," she greeted, voice perfectly measured. "How unexpected." He bowed slightly. "Lady Clara, it's been some years." "7," she replied. "But who counts?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes, those clear, sharp eyes, held the faintest glimmer of challenge. "I scarcely recognized you," he admitted, his voice low. She smiled thinly. "And I recognized you at once. Some faces," she paused delicately, "are hard to forget." Her words stung, though her expression betrayed nothing. They stood there, two ghosts of their former selves, speaking as though the past had not once burned them alive. Around them, dancers swirled, laughter rose, and still they lingered, bound by something unnamed. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and musicians softened their tune, Elias found her again in the garden. She stood alone beneath a marble arch, moonlight brushing her hair with silver. "Forgive my intrusion," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "You rarely ask forgiveness, Your Grace. I'm almost flattered." He stepped closer, careful not to bridge the space too soon. "I owe it to you." "For what?" she asked, finally facing him. "For being a fool." Her laugh was soft, but edged with sadness. A rare confession from a duke. "I was young," he continued, "and thought pride would protect me. I was wrong. Pride only made me a coward." She studied him, really studied him, for the first time in years. The man before her was not the boy who had mocked her innocence. His arrogance had dimmed. His eyes carried the weight of loneliness, not conceit. And yet she could not let him see the fracture he still caused within her. "You mistake remorse for affection, my lord," she said gently, throwing his own words back at him. He flinched, visibly, painfully, then nodded once. "Perhaps I do, or perhaps I finally understand the difference." A silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Then she curtsied, the motion elegant and final. "Good night, Your Grace. May you find the peace you once denied me." And before he could speak, she turned, her emerald skirts whispering through the moonlight as she walked away. He stood there long after she was gone, her scent lingering in the air, jasmine and regret, and realized that for the first time in his life, Elias Hawthorne, the Duke of Ashbourne, had been left behind. In the weeks that followed the Winthorne ball, London society found a new fascination. The uncomfortable reappearance of the Duke of Ashbourne and Lady Clara Winthorne in the same drawing rooms, at the same dinners, under the same chandeliers that once bore witness to heartbreak. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humour. Wherever Clara went, he was there. At Lady Ellington's musicals, she caught his gaze from across the room. At the Queen's charity garden party, he stood beside her by accident, or perhaps not. Even at church, where whispers were frowned upon, tongues wagged the moment they bowed their heads 2 pews apart. "Do you believe in Providence, my lady?" he asked once, their paths crossing again, at a painting exhibition in Mayfair. "I believe in irony, Your Grace," she replied, smoothly, not looking at him. Her poise only sharpened his regret. She was no longer the blushing girl he'd wounded, but a woman who met the world and him on her own terms. She had built walls of grace and silence so tall that he doubted even God himself could climb them, and yet he kept trying. That night, at the Viscountess Danbury's masquerade, the current of their unspoken history drew them together again. She wore silver silk and a mask of pale lace. He recognized her instantly, not by the mask, but by the way she held herself, poised but unafraid. When he asked her for a dance, she hesitated only long enough to remind him of her power. "I suppose I owe you one," she said lightly. "You denied me my first." The orchestra began, and for the first time since their youth, they waltzed again, this time not as dreamer and destroyer, but as adversaries. "You've changed," he said quietly, as they turned beneath the candlelight. Her lips curved. "No, Your Grace, I simply grew up." He studied her face, the soft determination there, the quiet fire. "And have you forgiven me for being a fool?" "Forgiveness is overrated," she said, eyes fixed ahead. "Memory is far more useful." He winced, though his voice remained steady. "You wound me." "You managed that years ago," she murmured. The dance continued in silence, the kind that carried a heartbeat. When the final note lingered in the air, his hand tightened slightly at her waist. A moment's hesitation, a plea unspoken. She stepped back first. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and left before he could bow. He watched her go, her silver gown glimmering like moonlight, retreating into shadow, and realized that every rejection he'd once delivered had come back to him, exquisitely repaid. Society noticed, of course, they always did. The gossip columns wrote of a certain duke whose heart has thawed, and a lady of former scandal who refuses to be won. Invitations increased, so did speculation. "She's toying with you," said Lord Everett one evening over brandy at the club. "Every woman enjoys seeing a former heartbreak crawl back with flowers." Elias only smiled thinly. "Then I suppose I deserve the lesson." "You can't rewrite the past," Everett warned. "No," Elias said softly, staring into his glass. "But perhaps I can mend what I broke." He did not tell his friend that he had begun writing to Clara. Letters he never sent, lines filled with apologies too fragile to survive the daylight. He'd write them at midnight and burn them by dawn, the scent of ink and smoke filling his study. Clara, meanwhile, told herself she felt nothing. She repeated it like a prayer. And yet, when she received his calling card the next morning, her fingers trembled. He came to call on her at Aunt Beatrice's townhouse, bringing no flowers, no excuses, only sincerity. "You honour us, Your Grace," said Aunt Beatrice, her tone sharp with suspicion. "Lady Clara is quite occupied." "I will wait," he said simply. And he did. For nearly an hour he sat in the drawing-room, his gloved hands folded neatly, his patience unwavering. When Clara finally entered, his breath caught as if he had been holding it for years. "Your Grace," she said coolly. "You seem persistent." He stood. "I seem regretful." "An ailment easily cured with time." "Not this one," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Time has made it worse." For a moment she faltered. just slightly, before regaining her composure. "You always did know how to sound sincere, Elias." "And you," he said softly, "always knew how to make me mean it." The air thickened with the kind of tension that makes breathing a conscious effort. When he took a hesitant step forward, she drew back, not from fear, but from the danger of remembering how it once felt to be near him. "I can't undo what I said," he murmured, "but I would give anything to go back and say it differently." She looked at him for a long time, searching his face for deceit, and found only truth. Then, with a sigh that trembled between anger and ache, she said, "You can't change the past, Elias. You can only decide whether to keep living in it." He nodded, the faintest ghost of a smile on his lips. "Then teach me how to live in yours." But she only turned toward the window, hiding her tears in the light. "I no longer take pupils, Your Grace." That evening, she attended a concert at Lady Greer's salon. He was there too, uninvited, unashamed, standing at the back of the room while she played the pianoforte. The melody was soft, wistful, full of things that could not be spoken aloud. When her fingers faltered slightly on the keys, just once, their eyes met across the crowd. He smiled, faintly, reverently. And in that single moment she realized that no matter how carefully she built her armor, part of her heart had never stopped waiting for his apology. When the concert ended, he approached her once more. "You played beautifully," he said quietly. "And you listened beautifully," she replied, tone teasing, but eyes soft. He bowed. "For once, I know my place." She hesitated, then almost imperceptibly smiled. "Then perhaps you've learned something after all?" He took a breath as if to speak again, but the carriage was already waiting. As she turned to leave, his voice reached her, low, unsteady. "Clara, will you ever allow me to earn what I once threw away?" She stopped at the door, her back to him. "If I do," she said softly, "you'll have to kneel for it." And then she was gone, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her words, and the growing certainty that one day he would. Spring had just begun to unfurl in London when the first whisper appeared in the Morning Gazette. What began as a murmur over breakfast tables became a storm by afternoon tea. The words were brief, veiled in clever innuendo. "A certain lady of former innocence has lately regained the Duke of Ashbourne's attention through means not entirely virtuous." No names were written, but the ton needed none. They were wolves when it came to scenting scandal. By sundown, the gossip had found its prey, Lady Clara Winthorne. The rumours were cruel, vivid, and deliberate. They painted her as a schemer, a fallen woman who used pity and charm to ensnare a duke. And worst of all, they claimed she had been seen in private correspondence with a married baron. When the news reached Clara, she sat frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. "It's filth!" Aunt Beatrice fumed, slamming her teacup down. "Jealous tongues! You must write to the editor immediately." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "And feed them more scandal? I will not defend myself in print. Silence, Aunt, is my dignity." But dignity had a cruel cost. Within days, friends began to withdraw invitations. The ladies who once called her charming now looked through her as if she were invisible, and everywhere she went, she felt the sting of unseen eyes, pitying, judging, devouring. Elias heard of it 3 days later, when Lord Everett tossed the paper across his desk. "You've seen this?" Elias scanned the paragraph once, his jaw tightened. "Who wrote it?" "Doesn't say, but the Gazette's editor claims it came from an anonymous source, likely someone with motive, Perhaps that spurned baroness she humiliated at the Danbury fete. Everett paused, frowning. Best to stay clear, old friend. The scent of scandal ruins even the innocent. Elias rose from his chair, fury barely contained. Then I suppose I'll ruin myself too. That evening, Clara sat in her drawing room, pale and motionless, when the door burst open. Elias strode in, his eyes burning. "Elias, Your Grace," she stammered, rising. "You shouldn't be here." "Shouldn't I?" His voice was low, trembling with anger. "When London tears your name to ribbons and I do nothing? You think I can stand by while they destroy you?" Her composure cracked for the first time. "And what would you do? Duel every gossip in Mayfair?" "If I must." She almost laughed, almost. "You cannot silence the tongue with your sword." "No," he said, stepping closer. "But I can silence them with my name." She froze. "What do you mean?" He took her hands in his. "Let me end this. Marry me." The words hung between them, heavy as thunder. Clara's breath caught. "Marry you? Out of pity? Out of guilt?" "Out
"Of love," he said fiercely. "And if not love, then penance. Let the world see that I choose you. Not as rumour, not as scandal, but as truth." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but she knew better than to mistake desperation for devotion. "No, Elias," she whispered. "Not like this. I will not be your absolution." He looked stricken. "You think I care for absolution?" "I think," she said softly, "you care too much for honour. You would marry me to save face, yours or mine, and call it love." The silence that followed was unbearable. His grip loosened, his eyes searching hers for something he couldn't name. "Clara," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I ruined you once with pride. Must you let me ruin you again with humility?" Her tears slipped before she could stop them. "Then leave before you do." He hesitated, then bowed, low, reverent, defeated. "As you wish, my lady." When the door closed, the sound echoed through her chest like finality. But the gossip did not die. The next day's papers doubled down. Now the whispers named them both. The Duke who pursued scandal and the lady who welcomed it. Their friendship, their encounters, even the masquerade waltz, all recast in the ugliest of lights. By evening, the scandal had spread to Parliament itself. Ministers murmured that the Duke of Ashbourne's conduct disgraced the moral decorum expected of his station. Invitations were rescinded, proposals of alliance vanished overnight. Elias stood before his mirror again, just as he had months ago, but this time he saw clearly. Pride had cost him love once, fear would not cost him again. He ordered his carriage. The next morning, the Gazette published a letter signed in elegant, unmistakable handwriting. "To those who find pleasure in destroying a lady's name, I declare upon my honour that Lady Clara Winthorne is beyond reproach. The scandal you cherish is false. The impropriety lies not in her conduct, but in your cruelty. As Duke of Ashbourne, I claim full responsibility for any misinterpretation of our association, and any consequence shall fall solely upon me. Elias Hawthorne, Duke of Ashbourne." The letter sent London into an uproar. Some called it madness, others called it gallantry, but all agreed on one thing. The Duke had damned himself to save her. Clara read the statement in stunned silence. Her heart pounded, torn between fury and awe. He had sacrificed everything, his reputation, his alliances, his power, for her name. Hours later, she found him in the gardens of his townhouse, standing beneath a budding magnolia tree, his coat undone, his dignity still intact. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would you do this?" He turned, meeting her gaze with a tired smile. Because I finally learned the difference between protecting my pride and protecting what matters. You'll be ruined. He shrugged. Then let ruin come. It will be worth it. Her lips trembled. You fool. I know, he said gently, but this time I'm your fool. Something in her broke. The last piece of bitterness, the final wall. She reached for him but stopped halfway, her fingers hovering near his chest. Don't do this for me, Elias, she whispered. Do it for the man you could have been all along. He took her hand then, pressing it to his heart. That man only exists because of you. That night, as thunder rolled over London, the Gazette's editor received an anonymous note. It contained proof that the original rumour had been planted by none other than the Duke's former fiancée, the very woman whose vanity had been wounded by Clara's grace. The story collapsed by dawn, but for society's cruel amusement, truth never mattered as much as spectacle. The Duke's letter had made him a pariah, and in doing so had made him free. For the first time, Elias Hawthorne had nothing left to lose except the woman he loved. Weeks passed since the storm of scandal had broken and faded, leaving behind the quiet ache of consequence. London, ever hungry for gossip, had moved on to newer amusements, but for Lady Clara Winthorne, peace did not return. Not truly. The Duke's public defence had ended the whispers, yes, but it had also destroyed him. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends he'd known since boyhood avoided his name. In the clubs, men spoke of him in lowered tones, half in pity, half in disdain. He had thrown away privilege for principle, and society had no mercy for such crimes. And yet, when Clara thought of him, the man who had once wounded her pride and then humbled himself before the world, her heart ached with something dangerously close to love. Still she did not visit. Pride, even softened by affection, held its ground. Until one grey morning, fate, as ever, interfered. She had gone to her late aunt's country estate in Devonshire, hoping to quiet her thoughts in solitude. The manor was empty now, save for dust and memories. As she sorted through boxes of old letters and documents, she found a packet tied in faded blue ribbon, tucked deep within a drawer of her aunt's writing desk. At first, she thought them family correspondence, until she saw the handwriting. His, Elias Hawthorne's unmistakable hand. Her pulse quickened. There were a dozen letters, each sealed but never sent. The earliest dated 3 years after his cruel rejection, the most recent only months before his return to London. Her fingers trembled as she opened the first. My dearest Clara, I have no right to write to you, and yet I find myself doing so, as one might confess to an empty room. I told you once that pride was safer than affection. I know now that it is merely lonelier. Her breath caught. She unfolded another. The world praises me, but I am a hollow man, applauded by strangers and haunted by your silence. I see you sometimes in
memory, in a garden of roses, in the pale blue of a dress, in the way the light bends when it forgives, and another, written heartbreakingly after his father's death. You once said I would end alone. You were right. I find that I fear not solitude itself, but the absence of you within it. By the time she reached the final letter, tears blurred the ink. If I am remembered at all, let it not be as the man who broke your heart, but as the one who finally understood what it cost him. Should we meet again, if heaven allows, I will beg not for your love, but for your forgiveness. The paper fell from her hands. For years she had believed herself forgotten, dismissed, unworthy of his regard. But he had loved her, quietly, secretly. and too late. That evening, as rain began to fall outside, Clara sat by the window, the letters spread around her like relics of a lost time. She had spent years mastering composure, learning how not to feel, how to survive in a world where women were measured by restraint. But the sight of his words undid every wall she had built. "Foolish man," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you send them?" The answer, she realized, was pride. The same pride that had once kept him from love, then from peace, and now perhaps from happiness. And suddenly she knew she could not stay still. She could not sit in Devonshire reading the ghosts of his remorse while he lived a few days' ride away, haunted by what could have been. Before dawn she called for her carriage. The journey to Ashbourne Manor was long, the roads wet and the sky pale with mist. As the countryside rolled past, Clara rehearsed a dozen speeches in her head, none of which seemed to survive the pounding of her heart. What would she say when she saw him? That she forgave him? That she loved him? That she wished she didn't? By the time her carriage arrived at the manor gates, her courage had thinned to a thread. The estate was silent, no carriages, no servants bustling about, only the lonely call of crows in the trees. She was led inside by a single footman, his expression hesitant. "His Grace is not receiving visitors, my lady." "Tell him Lady Winthorne insists." The man hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the corridor. Moments later, he returned, murmuring, "He will see you, but prepare yourself, my lady." Clara frowned, but followed. She found Elias in the library, seated near the fire. He looked nothing like the man who had once commanded every ballroom in London. His hair had grown slightly unruly, his clothes plain, his face pale. Yet when he lifted his head and saw her standing there, something like light flickered back into his eyes. "Clara," he said softly, her name barely more than a breath. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You look dreadful." He gave a tired smile. "I had hoped to impress you with my ruin." Tears threatened, but she managed a soft laugh. "You never fail to do the unexpected." For a long moment they said nothing more. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, gentle and human. Finally she spoke, holding out the packet of letters. "I found these." He froze. "Where?" "In my aunt's desk. You sent them to her. She must have kept them hidden from me." His face went pale. "Then you've read them?" "I have," she said quietly. "Every word." He looked away, his hands trembling. "Then you know the truth. Too late, as always." She shook her head. "No, Elias. For once, not too late." He looked up sharply. "You came all this way just to tell me that?" "I came," she said, stepping closer, "to tell you that if I had read even one of these years ago, I would have forgiven you long before now." His breath caught. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now I think I've spent enough time forgiving you. Perhaps it's time I start loving you instead." For a moment, neither moved. Then slowly, hesitantly, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "After everything I've done," he whispered, voice raw, "you'd still risk your name for me?" Her reply was soft but certain. "My name survived you once. It can survive loving you again." And with that she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. The years of distance, of pain, of unspoken longing dissolved like mist. Outside, the rain softened to a gentle patter against the windows. Inside, by the firelight, two souls, once broken by pride, found their way back to the same heartbeat. The morning after the storm broke bright and cold, sunlight spilling through the long windows of Ashbourne Manor, as if heaven itself had decided to forgive the house at last. For years, those halls had echoed with silence, pride, regret, and ghosts. But now, for the first time in a decade, laughter whispered between the walls, soft, hesitant, healing. Lady Clara Winthorne stood by the great window of the Duke's library, gazing out over the frost-touched gardens. The air smelled faintly of pine and paper, the scent of new beginnings. Behind her, she could hear the quiet rhythm of Elias Hawthorne moving about the room, setting aside books, adjusting the fire, finding purpose in motion. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer strained. It was tender, full of all the words they no longer needed to say. Finally she broke it. "You've written again," she said softly, gesturing to the stack of fresh letters on his desk. He smiled faintly. "Habit dies hard." "And to whom do you write this time?" He hesitated, glancing at her. "To you, as always. But now you might actually read them." She turned, meeting his gaze. "And what do they say?" He crossed the room, stopping just a breath away. "They say, I am a man who once mistook silence for strength, and that I've learned that love speaks louder than any title ever could." Her eyes softened, glistening in the morning light. "You always did have a gift for words, Elias." "Not words," he murmured, reaching to touch her cheek. "Only truth." The day passed quietly. They walked through the winter gardens, the very place he had first rejected her years ago. The same gravel paths, the same marble fountain, though the roses had long withered. And yet there was beauty even in their bareness. "I remember standing here," Clara said, her gloved hand brushing the edge of the fountain. "I remember thinking that I would forget you one day." He smiled sadly. "And did you?" She looked up at him. "Every day. And every day I failed." Elias exhaled, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a prayer. "I used to believe destiny was a chain, something forged by blood and duty. But now I think it's a thread. And somehow, no matter how far I pulled away, it kept leading back to you." Clara's lips trembled, but her voice remained steady. "Then perhaps destiny has more patience than pride." He laughed softly, the sound low and disbelieving. "I spent 10 years convincing myself I was above love, but when you walked into that ballroom again, I realized I hadn't been living, only enduring." She stepped closer, her breath misting in the cold air. "Then stop enduring, Elias." He looked at her, truly looked, and something within him broke open at last. "Clara, I cannot offer you the man I once was. He was proud, cruel, and unworthy of your heart. All I have left is this." And before she could respond, he dropped to one knee. The frost glittered around them, the breath of winter curling like smoke. She stared down at him, stunned, not because a duke knelt before her, but because he did so without hesitation, without pride. "Elias," she breathed. He took her hand, his voice unsteady but clear. "I rejected you once because I was afraid. You saw me, not the title, not the name, and I didn't know how to be that man. I thought love would weaken me, but it's the only thing that's ever made me strong." Her eyes filled, her voice breaking. "Please, stand. You don't need to." "Yes, I do," he said, a tear slipping free, catching in the sunlight. "I have spent my whole life standing above others, and it brought me nothing but loneliness. Let me kneel this once, not as the Duke of Ashbourne, but as the man who owes you everything." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The sight of him there, proud and broken, strong and trembling, was more than her heart could bear. "Elias," she whispered, kneeling before him so they were level. "You never owed me anything, but if you must kneel, then let it be beside me." He looked at her, astonishment flickering into joy. "Then say you'll stay." She smiled through her tears. "I didn't come here to leave." And when he kissed her, it was not the desperate kiss of redemption, but the gentle seal of a promise, one written not in ink or duty, but in devotion. Weeks later, London buzzed again with gossip, though this time the whispers were almost reverent. The disgraced Duke and the scandalized lady had done the unthinkable. They had married quietly in the countryside, without spectacle, without the blessing of society's hypocrites. Some called it folly, others called it romance. But to those who saw them together, in the gardens of Ashbourne, laughing like conspirators or walking through the village hand in hand, there was no question. They had found something purer than reputation, something even time had failed to erase. One afternoon in early spring, Clara found Elias seated in the library once more, pen in hand. She smiled. "Another letter, Your Grace." He grinned. "A habit I can't seem to break." "Then to whom this time?" He looked up, his eyes soft. "To our children, so they might know that love, real love, is worth every bruise to one's pride." She moved behind him, resting her chin on his shoulder. "And what will you tell them about their mother?" "That she was the bravest person I ever knew," he said. "Because she forgave me before I learned to forgive myself." Her arms slid around him, and he leaned back into her touch. The fire crackled gently, the pages rustled in the soft breeze. And peace, that elusive, stubborn thing, finally settled in the heart of Ashbourne Manor. That evening, as twilight spilled gold across the windows, Clara walked once more through the garden. The roses had begun to bloom again, delicate, defiant, alive. Behind her, she heard Elias's footsteps on the path. "You'll catch cold," he said, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She smiled. "You worry too much, my lord." He brushed a curl from her cheek. "Not enough, my lady." They stood there in silence, the sky painted in shades of lavender and amber, the air rich with the scent of spring. Clara looked up at him and whispered, "Do you know what I remember most from that night long ago?" He shook his head. "You said pride was safer than affection." He smiled, eyes shining. "And you proved me wrong." She laughed softly, the sound carried away by the breeze. "Good. Then perhaps it's time the world saw what love looks like when it wins." He bent his head, kissing her forehead with reverence. "It looks like you, Clara." And as they stood together beneath the blooming roses, sunlight falling over them like benediction, the man who once rejected love finally understood that destiny was not a punishment. It was grace.